Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast. And welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
Strange stories that were reported to the police thread. Shortly after 2 a.m. on the 28th of November 1954, Gustavo Gonzalez and Jose Ponce were driving from Caracas, Venezuela, to a nearby town when they encountered a luminous sphere about 10 feet in diameter, hovering just above the ground and nearly blocking the roadway. The two men got out of their truck to investigate, and a little hairy man, about 3 feet tall, approached them. Gonzalez immediately grabbed him, intending to take him to the police. To his surprise, Gonzalez found the little man extremely light, weighing only about 35 pounds. His body was very hard and covered with stiff, bristly hair. The little man gave Gonzalez a push with one clawed hand and sent him flying about 15 feet. Ponce, who was Gonzalez's helper, became frightened and ran to the police station, located a short distance away. As he departed, he noticed two other little men emerging from the bushes. They were carrying either rocks or chunks of dirt in their arms as they hopped aboard an opening in the side of the sphere. Meanwhile, the first hairy little man, eyes aglow and claws extended, attacked Gonzalez. Pulling out his knife, Gonzalez stabbed the creature in the shoulder, but the knife glanced off as if the shoulder were made of steel. Then another little man emerged from the sphere and shot a beam of light from a small tube, momentarily blinding Gonzalez. When the two little men climbed back aboard, the sphere took off rapidly. Gonzalez arrived at the police station shortly after Ponce. The two were suspected of being drunk, but an examination revealed otherwise. Gonzalez was found to have a long red scratch on his side. The two were given sedatives. Several days later, a doctor came forward, admitting that he had seen the fracas with the creatures, but that he had left the scene, as he did not want to be involved in undesirable publicity.
At about 7 p.m., on a hot summer night, Billy Ray told the Suttons he had just seen a flying saucer with rainbow-colored exhaust fly across the sky and drop into a gully near their farmhouse. The Suttons laughed at his story. Half an hour later, the dog began barking and hid under the house. When Billy Ray and Lucky went to the back door, they saw an approaching glow that turned out to be a 3.5-foot-tall creature with a round, oversized, bald head. The creature's skin was a silver metallic color and glowed in the dark. Its yellow eyes were large and set halfway around the side of its face. The creature's arms were almost twice as long as its legs and nearly touched the ground. Its hands were large and bore talons. The men grabbed their guns, a .22 rifle and a shotgun, and waited until the creature was within 20 feet of the back door before opening fire. The shots sounded like they hit a metal bucket, but the visitor simply flipped over backward and scurried off into the darkness. When another visitor appeared at the window, the men shot at it through the screen. Thinking the creature had been killed, Billy Ray went out the front door to find the body. As he paused momentarily under the roof's overhang, a claw-like hand reached down and touched his hair. The family screamed and pulled him back inside as Lucky ran out, turned, and fired at the creature, knocking it off the roof. Both men then fired at another creature in the maple tree nearby, but it too merely floated to the ground and scurried away. Unnerved by the ineffectiveness of their guns, the family bolted themselves inside the house, but the creatures kept returning to peer in the windows, and after 3 hours, the 8 terrorized adults and 3 frightened children piled into 2 cars and headed off into town to the police. The Hopkinsville police returned to the farmhouse with the family and surveyed the house and surroundings but found nothing. Shortly after the police left at 2:15 a.m., the creatures returned, staring into windows, curious but never hostile. Again, the men responded with gunfire. This continued until a half hour before sunrise. That morning, investigators returned but again found nothing.
One morning in July 1983 in Mount Vernon, Missouri, Ron and Paula Watson noticed some bright silver flashes coming from the pasture across from their farmhouse. Through binoculars, they saw two silver-suited beings running their hands over a motionless black cow lying on the ground. The beings made jerky movements with their hands over the cow, which suddenly rose into the air and floated up with the beings into a cone-shaped object that stood near a clump of trees. Two other strange-looking creatures were standing next to the object. On the left was a tall, green-skinned lizard man. Its glaring eyes had the vertical pupils of a reptile, and its hands and feet were webbed. On the right of the craft was a taller Bigfoot-type creature that also had yellow vertical slits and round green eyes. The beings entered the craft with the cow, and the craft then disappeared. The owner of the pasture later confirmed that one of his black cows was missing. It was never found.
In the morning of the 18th of April, 1961, Joe Simonton, a 60-year-old chicken farmer from Wisconsin, heard a peculiar noise outside his home. Stepping out into the yard, he saw a silvery object hovering close to the ground. It was shaped like two inverted bowls and measured about 12 feet high and 30 feet in diameter. A hatch opened and Simonton saw three men inside, about 5 feet tall. They had dark hair and skin and wore outfits with turtleneck tops and knit helmets. One of the men held up a jug and motioned to Simonton that he needed water. When Simonton returned with the water, he noticed that one of the men in the saucer was frying food on a flameless grill. He saw several instrument panels in the ship's black interior and heard a slow whining sound. When he made a motion indicating he was interested in the food, one of the men handed him 3 pancakes, about 3 inches in diameter and perforated with small holes. The hatch was then closed, and the object rose about 20 feet from the ground before taking off straight south, causing a blast of air that bent some nearby pine trees. The whole affair lasted about 5 minutes. Simonton ate one of the pancakes and described it as tasting like cardboard. Air Force investigators had a piece analyzed by the Food and Drug Laboratory, which concluded it was an ordinary pancake of terrestrial origin. The official explanation was that Simonton sincerely believed his contact had been a real experience, but that he had merely had a dream and inserted it into the events taking place around him while he was conscious. The question of food is one of the points most frequently treated in Celtic legends. Tales about fairies exchanging food with humans are commonplace. Evans Wentz reports in his book Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries, 1909, that an Irishman told him that the gentry eat fresh meat and drink pure water and never eat anything with salt in it. Pure water is what the saucer beings took from Simonton, and the analysis performed for the Air Force did not mention the presence of salt in the pancakes. They did, however, contain buckwheat hulls, and buckwheat is closely associated with fairy legends in Brittany.
Never eat anything with salt in it. Demons don't like salt either.
In 1986, in the Russian city of Ulyanovsk, Mr. N opened his front door and found himself confronted with a man about 7 feet tall, wearing silver overalls and boots. The man declared he was an alien and needed food. Mr. N was so shocked he took the guest to the kitchen and started packing groceries for him. He told the visitor he was late for work, and the visitor answered, "I understand," in a Russian spoken with a marked accent. The two left the house together, but when Mr. N got on the bus, the strange visitor was nowhere to be seen. All day he felt anxious and disturbed. Something urged him to return home as soon as possible, and he found an excuse to leave early. After unlocking the front door, he ran to the kitchen, where he discovered that the remaining food had been taken. Empty paper bags, packages, and wrappings lay everywhere, and there were grains of rice, millet, and salt in the cracks in the floor. The refrigerator and the cupboards were empty. But if the visitor was the culprit, why did he need to unwrap everything? The man's wife found his explanation for the missing food absurd. A terrible scandal followed, and the couple came close to a divorce, a situation that is common in the aftermath of close encounters.
The alien robbed him.
On April 1932, Colonel Lieutenant Emps P. Fordyce and his wife were driving through the woods along the south side of Loch Ness when they saw an enormous animal cross the road 150 yards ahead, apparently on its way to the water. It was described as a cross between a very large horse and a camel, with a hump on its back and a small head on a long neck, but with the gait of an elephant. The man followed it on foot for a short distance. From the rear it looked grey and shaggy, with long thin legs and a thin hairy tail. Similarly unlikely beasts have been reported in other land sightings over the centuries. Curiously, land sightings ceased after the mid-1930s, with the exception of an incident in 1960 when a man observed a long-necked animal with flippers. The upper half was on the shore with the lower half tapering off into the water. He watched it through binoculars for 9 minutes before it half jumped and half lurched to the left, flopped into the water, and went straight down. Even aquatic sightings are not always of animals that look like the classic monster. People have seen things resembling a large alligator, a crocodile, a great salamander, and a huge frog.
Why do we always shoot and assault them?
The unknown is scary. Aggression is a common fear response.
In September 1837, a strange being dubbed Spring-Heel Jack assaulted 4 separate persons, 3 of them women, in and around London. In one instance, he ripped off the top of a victim's dress, scratching her belly with iron-like fingers. He was tall, thin, and powerful, wore a cloak and had pointed ears, glowing eyes, and a mouth that spat blue flames into victims' faces. After London's Lord Mayor had declared him a menace, vigilantes attempted to capture Jack, but without success, as he was able to make enormous leaps or simply melted into the night. Sporadic attacks continued during the next 2 years, and a few were recorded in 1843. In 1845, in daylight and in view of numerous witnesses, Jack bounded towards a young prostitute who was crossing a bridge in a London slum. Grabbing her by the shoulders, he breathed fire into her face, tossed her into the open sewer below, and watched her drown. This was the only murder to which he was linked. Attacks continued throughout the 1850s and 60s. In 1877, nearly all the residents of Caister, Norfolk, saw Jack bounding from rooftop to rooftop. In August, he appeared before soldiers at a military base in Aldershot. He was clad in an oilskin suit and wearing a shining helmet. A sentry fired on him and claimed that his bullet passed through him without effect. Jack's last known return to England was in Liverpool in 1904, when he was seen leaping from the ground to the rooftops and back again. Illustration is of Spring-Heel Jack's appearance in Aldershot, 1877. Investigating authorities in the 19th century assumed Jack must be a real person despite his weird appearance and behavior. There was a rumor that he was actually Henry, the Marquis of Waterford, a young Irish nobleman who supposedly used springs concealed in his boots to leap about. However, not only is it impossible to make huge leaps in this way, but Jack continued his activities long after Waterford's death in 1859. A figure similar to Spring-Heel Jack was observed in the U.S. in June 1953. 3 Houston residents saw a huge shadow cross the lawn and bounce upward into a pecan tree. A dim gray light illuminated the figure. It was a tall man with a black cape, skin-tight clothes, and quarter-length boots. After a few minutes, the figure just melted away, and his disappearance was followed by a loud swoosh across the street and the rapid ascent of a rocket-shaped object.
On 12th of September 1952, 3 boys in the tiny West Virginia town of Flatwoods saw a reddish sphere move slowly around a hill, hover briefly, and drop behind another hill. From the other side, a bright glow shone as if from a landed object. On their way to investigate, the boys were joined by Kathleen May, her 2 young sons, their friend Tommy Heyer, 17-year-old Eugene Lemon, and Lemon's dog. The dog ran ahead of the group and was briefly out of sight. Suddenly it was heard barking furiously and moments later, seen fleeing with its tail tucked between its legs. A foul-smelling mist covered the ground and caused the searchers' eyes to water. The 2 leading the group, Lemon and Neil Nunley, who got to the top first, looked down and observed a big ball of fire 50 feet to their right. Another of the witnesses reported it was the size of a house. To the group's left, on the hilltop and just under the branch of an oak tree, were 2 small lights. At Mrs. May's suggestion, Lemon turned his flashlight on them. To everyone's considerable astonishment, The beam highlighted a grotesque-looking creature with a head shaped like the ace of spades, as several of the observers independently described it. Inside the head was a circular window, dark except for the two lights from which pale blue beams extended straight ahead. In their short observation of the creature, the group saw nothing that looked like arms or legs. The creature, which appeared to be over 6 feet tall, moved toward the witnesses. It seemed to be gliding rather than walking. Seconds later, it changed direction, turning toward the glowing ball down the hill. All of this allegedly took place in a matter of seconds, during which Lemon fainted. The others dragged him away as they ran from the scene. A reporter went to the site with one of the youths about half an hour later. He noticed an unusual odor in the grass that irritated his nose and throat. Returning to the site alone the next morning, he found skid marks going down the hill towards an area of matted grass, indicating the recent presence of a large object. This encounter with what the press dubbed the Flatwoods monster took place during a flurry of sightings of unusual flying objects in the area. One man told of seeing a bright orange ball circling over the area where the monster was reported. The object was visible for 15 minutes before shooting towards the airport at Sutton, where it was also seen.
In November 1958, a man from Riverside, California, was driving in a car near the Santa Ana River when he was attacked by a creature with a round, scarecrowish head, shiny eyes, and scales. It left long scratches on his windshield, and as he accelerated, he hit it and drove over it. The following evening, another motorist claimed that the same kind of monster jumped out of the bushes at his car. In Loveland, Ohio, along the Miami River, reports of more or less reptilian bipeds have been made since at least 1955, when a driver reported spotting 3 grotesque-looking creatures with lopsided chests, wide, lipless, frog-like mouths, and wrinkles rather than hair on their heads. One held a spark-generating, bar-shaped device above itself. The driver observed them for 3 minutes. On 3rd March 1972, 2 Loveland police officers encountered a 4-foot-tall, frog-faced biped with textured leathery skin. They saw it jump over a guardrail and descend an embankment leading to the Little Miami River. About 2 weeks later, one of the officers saw the creature again, first lying in the road, then getting up to go over a guardrail. In the summer of 1972, at Thieves Lake, British Columbia, there were 2 reports of a silver-colored creature which emerged from the water. In the first incident, it chased a couple of young men from the beach, and one of them suffered lacerations in the hand from 6 sharp points on top of the thing's head. A witness to the second incident said it was shaped like an ordinary human body but had a monster-like face and was covered with scales, with a sharp point on its head and great big ears.
Reports of flying human-like beings are fairly rare but occur periodically. For instance, one night in 1952, U.S. Air Force Private Sinclair Taylor was on guard duty at Camp Okubo, Kyoto, Japan, when he heard a loud flapping noise. Looking up, he saw an enormous bird in the moonlight. When it approached, he got frightened and put a round into the chamber of his carbine. The bird now had stopped its flight and was hovering not far away, staring at the soldier. The thing, which now had started slowly to descend again, had the body of a man, Taylor recalled. It was well over 7 feet from head to feet, and its wingspread was almost equal to its height. I started to fire and emptied my carbine where the thing hit the ground, but when I looked up to see if my bullets had found home, there was nothing there. When the sergeant of the guard came to investigate and heard the story, he told Taylor that he believed him because a year earlier, another guard had seen the same thing. In August 19th of '69, several U.S. guards stationed near Da Nang, Vietnam, saw a naked woman with bat-like wings fly over their heads about 7 feet up. Her body, skin, and wings were black, but she glowed bright green. Her skin looked like it might have been covered with fur rather than feathers. The skin of her wings looked like it was molded to her hands, and the movement of her arms suggested they had no bones in them. At one point, the guards heard her wings flap. Some sightings are not of winged figures, but of humans or humanoids flying through the air, with the aid of mechanical devices attached to their bodies. For instance, on 6th of January 1948 in Chehalis, Washington, An elderly woman and a group of children saw a man with long mechanical wings, which he manipulated with instruments on his chest as he flew in an upright position. 6.5 years later, a 12-year-old farm boy in Coldwater, Kansas, saw a little man with pointed nose and ears float toward a UFO hovering nearby. On 16 November 1963 near Hythe, Kent, England, 4 people in their late teens were walking along a country road at night when one of them spotted a particularly bright star coming down from the sky. The group became alarmed when the reddish-yellow light seemed to head straight for them. It stopped to hover momentarily and then disappeared behind some trees. The frightened youngsters took to their heels, followed at a distance of about 250 feet by an oval-shaped golden light floating 10 feet above the ground. The object was about 15 to 20 feet across and had a solid core. When they stopped, the light stopped, giving them the impression that they were being watched. The glowing object again disappeared behind the trees, and moments later a dark figure emerged and shambled towards them across the field. They described it as black, human-sized but headless and possessing bat-like wings on either side of its body. One of the boys noted that it seemed to have webbed feet. The 4 fled the scene. A week later, investigators examining the site found a vast expanse of flattened ferns and 3 giant footprints measuring an inch deep, 2 feet long, and 9 inches across. 3 years later, in 1966 and 1967, a similar winged monstrosity, which newsmen dubbed Mothman, was seen over the Ohio River Valley in conjunction with strange lights in the sky and other weird events, including poltergeist outbreaks, men in black visitations, problems with televisions and phones, and cars stalling when passing close, an abandoned TNT plant near Point Pleasant, which seemed to be Mothman's lair. In one case, Mothman kept up with a car traveling at 100 miles per hour. It was also sighted on the ground, terrifying dogs and people. At least 100 people saw the creature. It was between 5 and 7 feet tall, broader than a man, and walked in a halting, shuffling manner on human-like legs. It had no discernible head, but it did have 2 large, glowing red eyes near the top of its shoulders. Its wings were bat-like but did not flap when it flew, and it typically ascended straight up. Its skin color was gray or brown. It emitted a screeching sound, and 2 observers said they heard a mechanical humming as it flew over them.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel, as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.
There's also a Rumble archive as a backup.